Joshua chapter 20 tonight, just a very short chapter. I want to tell you about the last person who was killed on September 11th, 2001. His name was Henryk Siwiak. He was a Polish immigrant, and he was fatally shot at about 10 minutes to midnight. He had mistakenly gone to a bad area of town, thinking that he was to start a new job there. Of course, earlier in the day, over 3,000 people had been killed as the towers came down. During the hours that followed during the day, all of the firemen, all the police officers, and all the emergency vehicles were still at ground zero trying to sort out what was happening. We are told that day that the city officials only recorded one homicide. They didn't count the thousands of people who died in the terrorist attack as homicides that day because they're an outlier in the statistics. And so the statistics say that Henryk Siwiak was in fact the only person killed in New York that day at a few minutes to midnight. He was a Polish immigrant. He was a plumber. He spoke no English. He'd been in the city for several years, and he thought that he finally had a lead for a job. He'd misunderstood that he was supposed to start his shift that night. He showed up in time. The shift had in fact been canceled, but he had no cell phone to be reached, and he went to a wrong area of town. Somebody gave him bad directions. He arrived dressed in camouflage clothing because it was the only work clothes that he had, and as he got off the subway in his camouflage clothing with a black hoodie for warmth, somebody mistook him, we think, for a terrorist, and he was fatally shot. The murder has never been solved. The homicide has really never been investigated, because in the midst of 3,000 other lives that were killed that day, that were taken that day, one more life just seemed like it was pointless and countless. And so every year when the victims of September 11th are remembered, when their names are read, the family of Henryk Siwiak gathers together at his graveside, and they remember alone this one death, this one solitary death that was never solved, that just seemed to pale in comparison to all of the others that had happened on that same day. The opening chapters of Joshua so far have contained an inordinate amount of bloodshed. Perhaps more death in the opening chapters of Joshua than we find in any other book. There's a destruction of Jericho, of Ai, and of several other large cities. These early chapters of Joshua become problematic when they're read in isolation from the rest of the book, and particularly when they're read in isolation from the short chapter we're going to read tonight. In fact, it is the shortest chapter in the book of Joshua, but it is probably one of the most significant. The heart of chapter 20 appears to be about the judicial follow-up for situations where manslaughter is committed. It highlights, in fact, the important difference between a premeditated murder, when someone willingly, maliciously, intentionally, with foresight and planning, kills another person, and manslaughter, where someone accidentally, or at least unintentionally, causes the death of another person. But while that is indeed the topic of the chapter, it is not the heart of the chapter. This chapter is not here primarily to resolve that legal question of the difference between manslaughter and homicide. This chapter is about the value of a single life in the eyes of God's justice. After reading about the death and the killing of thousands of people in the opening chapters of Joshua, this chapter asks us to pause and to think of the value of a single life in the eyes of the Lord our God. Joshua 20, starting at verse 1. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "Say to the people of Israel, appoint the cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who strikes any person without intent or unknowingly may flee there. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood." When I was growing up at home, we had a couple of traditions. When we were old enough to do that, we used the daily bread, and we gathered after supper time, and between supper and dessert somewhere, my dad would pull out the daily bread, and somebody would read the passage for the day, and we'd think about it and talk about it a little bit, and then somebody would read the little devotional piece, and then we'd have a word of prayer together. But before we were old enough to do our daily bread together, at bedtime, we did our little family devotions that way. We had a children's picture Bible. And on every page of the children's picture Bible, there was just a single picture, and at the bottom, just a couple of lines that either my mom or my dad would read before our bedtime prayers. And there are a couple of pictures that I still remember from the Children's Picture Bible. Sometimes as I read the texts of the Bible, I can think back to the picture that illustrates that. And there are a couple of pictures that gave me nightmares for a while. And one of them was the picture that illustrated the story of the city of refuge and the avenger of blood. And I remember there was a picture of somebody running for the gate of the city, running as quickly as he could, and not far behind him was somebody holding a big knife, the avenger of blood, coming for him. We're not told much here about the avenger of blood, but there's a little more in the instructions from Moses in Numbers 35. That's the first time where the cities of refuge appear. And in fact, they lay out very precise instructions both about the avenger of blood and about how to tell the difference between manslaughter and murder. Numbers 35 is very clear. If someone lay in wait for somebody else and struck them and killed them, that was considered murder. If you were hiding behind a door somewhere, hiding in a house, hiding in the woods, waiting for them to come, and when they come, you pounce on them, clearly that's premeditation, there's murder. If the killer intentionally struck someone with a weapon that could foreseeably have been expected to kill, made out of stone, metal, or wood, that was automatically considered murder. If there was clear malice and intent to harm, it was murder. And the text also includes a number of indications that would make a death accidental, that would make it manslaughter instead of murder. And then the instructions there stipulated that a member of the immediate family of the victim not only had the right, but had the obligation to avenge the blood of the victim of a murder. Somebody in the family, when someone was killed in intentional murder, had the responsibility to bring the killer to justice. But the text places limitations on the work of the avenger of blood. He could only avenge the death if it was clearly a murder and there wasn't the possibility of a manslaughter charge. And secondly, if the person he was after ran to the city of refuge, made it safely through the gates, the avenger of blood was never allowed to go into the city of refuge. Anybody there was off limits to him. So back to our text in Joshua 20. The Lord said to Joshua, "Say to the people of Israel, appoint the cities of refuge of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the manslayer who strikes any person without intent or unknowingly may flee there. They shall be for you a refuge from the avenger of blood. He shall flee to one of those cities and shall stand at the entrance of the gate of the city and explain his case to the elders of that city. Then they shall take him into the city and give him a place, and he shall remain with them. And if the avenger of blood pursues him, they shall not give up the manslayer into his hand, because he struck his neighbor unknowingly and did not hate him in the past. And he shall remain in that city until he has stood before the congregation for judgment, until the death of him who is high priest at the time. Then the manslayer may return to his own town and his own home, to the town from which he fled." So they set apart Kadesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, and Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, and Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. And beyond the Jordan, east of Jericho, they appointed Bezer in the wilderness of the tableland, from the tribe of Reuben, and Ramoth and Gilead, from the tribe of Gad, and Golan and Bashan, from the tribe of Manasseh. Incidentally, if you look at the geography of where the 6 cities were located, there was no place in Israel that was more than a day's journey from a city of refuge. No matter where you were in the whole country of Israel, somewhere there was one of the 6 cities of refuge that was within a day's journey for you. Verse 9, "These were the cities designated for all the people of Israel and for the strangers sojourning among them, that anyone who killed a person without intent could flee there, so that he might not die by the hand of the avenger of blood till he stood before the congregation." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I want to suggest to you tonight that the cities of refuge are about more than just determining murder and manslaughter. They actually reinforce the value of 5 things in the eyes of God. Number 1, the cities of refuge reinforce the value of each life in the eyes of God. Given the amount of bloodshed that we've seen in the early chapters of Joshua, it would be tempted to think, what's one more life, more or less? But God doesn't think that way. God thinks that each time a life is taken, care must be taken to understand why and how that life was taken, and then to take the appropriate steps toward justice. And that speaks backwards to what has already happened and speaks forward to what's to come. This speaks back to what we've seen during the conquest. In the institution about the cities of refuge, God says that each life should matter to us because each life matters to Him, and each life and death should be dealt with justly and equitably. As we look back then, this speaks to what God has done and what He was doing when He asked for the total destruction of pagan cities. We have this misunderstanding that when the children of Israel arrived to Jericho and to Ai and to the other cities, and God ordered the killing, the slaughter of all of those pagans, that God was saying, well, they're all roughly guilty. We'll just let's just deal away. It doesn't matter. Individually, it doesn't. That's not what God did. God does not condemn the innocent with the guilty. In chapter 20, the care with which He gives instructions about the difference between manslaughter and murder, the care with which He gives instructions about the cities of refuge says that in the eyes of God, not a single person is killed, not a single life is taken without God understanding and weighing in the balance innocence and guilt. In other words, every life that was taken in the early chapters of the conquest in Joshua was not taken lightly. Every life and death was weighed and counted and measured and justly rendered by God. In looking forward, as we underline the value of every life in the eyes of God, it would have been easy for people who entered the Promised Land and began their time in the Promised Land by seeing so much killing to continue living the same way. The institution of the cities of refuge says, wait a minute, hold on, let's catch our breath. Let's remember what each human life is worth. Secondly, the cities of refuge underline the value not just of justice, but of equitable justice. When someone was killed, you didn't shoot and ask questions later. There was not to be a lynch mob responding out of emotion, the immediacy of the moment, hanging the person who killed your relative on the nearest tree branch. The person who had done the killing was given the opportunity to make their way to the city of refuge. There they would wait in safety until a fair trial could be had in front of the elders of the city. This was not Western Western-style justice. Interestingly, when you look at the way the cities of refuge are set up, there are so many basic principles of justice that we take for granted in our modern justice that are actually just below the surface here. According to the laws of the cities of refuge, you are innocent until you are proven guilty, even when someone has been killed. According to the laws of the cities of refuge, the case is overseen by an impartial judge composed of the elders of the cities of refuge. It's not decided by the family of the victim in the heat of the moment. Sometimes equitable justice requires a change of venue. The people who are going to judge who's guilty of murder and who's guilty of manslaughter is not the neighbors in the town where the killing happened. It's not the family members of the victim. The trial is removed far away to the city of refuge, a great distance, perhaps as much as a day's journey from the place where it happened, where cooler heads prevailed, and where the elders of the city hear the victims, hear the witnesses, and hear from the families. There was due process. The elders had to take sufficient time to carefully assemble all the witnesses, to hear the evidence, and to render justice. Interestingly, I'm not sure if you missed it, but at the tail end there's an important passing comment in the final verse of the chapter that the protection of the cities of refuge were offered not just to the Israelites, but also to the sojourner, to the stranger, and to the foreigner in their midst. That would have included the Gibeonites, the family of Rahab, and any others who eventually shared the land with the people of God. There were not two systems of justice, one for us and one for everybody else, one for the Israelites and one for the foreigner, one for the rich and one for the poor, one for the city dwellers and one for... No, there was one system of justice. There is an ongoing controversial conversation among our neighbors to the south about the death penalty. Many conservative evangelical Christians very strongly push for the restoration of the death penalty in those states where it is no longer practiced. And what is of great concern is the very wide disparity between how the death penalty is applied unevenly between different races and different classes of people. I'm not sure there's a polite way to say it, but in most states, particularly in the Deep South, that are hungrier for the death penalty, if you are poor and black or Hispanic, your chances are much greater of being sent to the electric chair, of receiving a lethal injection. The cities of refuge were even open to the sojourner, to the foreigner, to the stranger. They welcomed the rich and the poor. They were open to the prestigious member of the community from an established family and to the new immigrants. The cities of refuge teach the value of equitable justice. Everyone is seen the same in the eyes of the law. Number 3, the cities of refuge teach the value of peace in the community. The surrounding nations all had the avengers of blood, but they did not have the cities of refuge. All the surrounding nation taught that if your family member was killed, you had a responsibility to bring the killer to justice. But none of them had cities of refuge. None of them had a pause button that said, wait, let's think about this. The avengers of blood would do their work unchecked. And you can imagine how quickly it would get out of hand with retaliation and counter-retaliation and ongoing multi-generation feuds between families. I'm not sure I should tell you this, but often when Debbie and I are together at home on Friday evenings and we don't have the energy to go out for a bite to eat, we don't have the energy to go out shopping or go out to a movie or do something else, we wind up having supper together at home. And there's a couple of TV shows that we sort of enjoy. And one of them is called Dateline. And sometimes they're a little rough and we have to choose which one we'd watch or not. But typically they're about a trial, and they're often about a murder trial, and they're based on historical fact and evidence. And we like watching murder mysteries, and there's a little thing to this because it's based on a real case. And as the case goes through, they actually take you through the process of the killer being caught and then the killer being brought to court. And there's always this moment near the end of the show where you see the court proceedings, and very visibly when a killer or an accused killer is brought to justice, and they show you the scenes that are filmed in the courtroom, you see this division in the audience. On one side, there's the family of the victim, and on the other side of the courtroom, there's the family of the killer. And I tell you, there are moments, let's just say if there weren't security guards in the courtroom, there's brawls that would occur. You can imagine what would happen when someone is killed, and the family thinks it was murder, and the family of the murderer thinks it was manslaughter. You can imagine how quickly things would degenerate. The cities of refuge put a necessary limitation, and it put the balance on the work of the avenger of blood. It hit the pause button. Fourthly, the cities of refuge taught the value of grace. Shortly before I left home, in the little city, the little village where I lived, there was this tragic incident. It is a farming community. The roads go through areas that were rolling hills and meadows. The little country roads are uneven and not always flat. There's hills, you go up and down, and it's not always easy to see what's just on the other side of that little slope that you come to, of that little crest. And the speed limit is reasonable. There's a speed limit of 50 kilometers an hour, but there's some stretches of the road that lead you into the main town and to Grammy that lead you to the highway. Shortly before I left home, there were two little children, two little toddlers below school age, and they were playing in the yard. They were playing in the driveway. They had a little wagon with wheels, and they were pushing each other on the wagon. They weren't paying attention, and before they knew it, they had rolled the little wagon, and they're in the middle of the street. And over the crest of the hill came an elderly gentleman. He was not the police determined that he was not driving over the speed limit. In fact, he was well below the speed limit. He came over the crest of the hill too late to stop in time, and he killed the two little toddlers in the little red wagon in the middle of the street. Witnesses report that as the gentleman stopped and got out of the car, he was sobbing and shaking with uncontrollable grief over what he had done. But it was an accident. And the cities of refuge said that sometimes an accident happens. An accident is an accident, and it's not a murder. A manslayer is not a murderer. The cities of refuge said to the family of the victim, sometimes accidents happen. But just as importantly, the city of refuge said to the one who had to live with the result of what he had done accidentally, that sometimes accidents happen. The value of grace. Fifth, the cities of refuge taught the value of restorative justice. The manslayer, the one who committed manslaughter, would live out his sentence in the city of refuge, essentially living alongside the Levites. Each one of the cities of refuge were in fact a Levitical city. Perhaps we think at times they were actually involved in working with the Levites in their pastoral work. It was a kind of community service. They weren't locked away in a prison in terrible working conditions. There is no prison in the Mosaic law. There's retribution, there's restitution, and there's restoration, but there's no prison. Retribution would happen when a murderer's life was taken. You've committed murder, and by order of God, your life will be taken. That's retribution. There would be restitution. That's what would happen when somebody stole one of your sheep, or somebody killed one of your bulls. They would make restitution. They would reimburse the cost of what had been taken. But restoration was about the care given to the person who perhaps inadvertently had caused unexpectedly painful results. The cities of refuge are selected after the allotment of the inheritance. This is interesting. The Lord assigns to all of the tribes, all the 12 tribes, their cities. He goes to each tribe, to Manasseh and to Ephraim and to Judah and to Reuben. He gives them all their cities, says this is your territory. And once each of the tribes have their territories, each of them have their cities, God says, okay, he says, I'm going to take a few of them back. You know, some of the cities I just gave you, some of them will be cities given to the Levite for the service of God, and some of them will be cities of refuge to take care of innocent people who've committed a regrettable accident. It's interesting that the people covered the cost of the cities of the Levites and the cities of refuge. These are really the only people, the only offenders, if you want to call manslayers offenders, who were cared for by society. But even they participated, even they did community service in the city of refuge. Calvin's commentary in this passage is really striking. Calvin says that the cities of refuge served three purposes. First, Calvin said it preserved the innocent by preventing the country from degenerating into a spiral of retributive vengeance. It put a stop, put a pause button. Secondly, and this one I thought was interesting, the city of refuge would free the family of the victim from the pain of the continued reminder of their loss because of the presence of the one who'd killed their loved one. Imagine you're in a little town, and the farmer next door has an accident one day, and he kills your young child. It was an accident. He didn't do it on purpose. But every time you see that neighbor next door, you would be reminded of the child that you had lost at his hand, accidentally, but that you'd lost at his hand. That person would be in the city of refuge. They wouldn't be next door. And thirdly, Calvin says, the cities of refuge placed a statute of limitations that allowed the community to move on. There are two striking events that are laid up in the law that we're not sure whether they were ever actually carried out, but they were really intriguing in what they set up. One of them was the Day of Jubilee. Every 7 years, there was a celebration, and every set of 7 years, every 49 years, on the 50th year, there was the year of Jubilee. And in that year of Jubilee, anybody that had fallen into debt, that had sold their family property, would get their family property back. Anybody that had fallen into deep debt and had had to sell themselves into slavery were freed from their slavery. Every 50 years, every Jubilee year, there was this reset button that was hit, where everything went back to its original owner, where all the slaves were freed, where everything started all over again. You know when you're playing a game of Monopoly, and you got that uncle or that brother in the family that 2 hours into the Monopoly game, he owns every property on the board, all the money, and everybody else on the verge of bankruptcy. Okay, imagine if you played Monopoly this way, and every half hour you hit the reset button, and you started back the way. Okay, this is what the year of Jubilee did. There was this tremendous rejoicing at this. And in fact, on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, the words that are inscribed there, let liberty be proclaimed throughout the land, those words from Leviticus, from the year of Jubilee celebration, are inscribed on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. All right. But there was a second event. When somebody committed manslaughter and was sent to the city of refuge, he would stay in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest who was in function. The high priest would begin serving when he was 25, and he would retire at 45. It's a 20-year term. Imagine all of a sudden the high priest dies, and all these people who are in the cities of refuge get to come home, back to their families. It would have been an amazing day, wouldn't it? A celebration of freedom. But there's one last piece about the cities of refuge that we don't want to miss. The cities of refuge, as I've said tonight and have taken pains to underline God's sense of justice and equity, that each life mattered, that justice was rendered equitably with justice for everyone. But there's this neat element in the cities of refuge that speaks of redemption. And many commentators, including many of the great theologians throughout Christian history, have noted that the cities of refuge speak to one final redemptive feature of God's justice. Those who were welcomed in the cities of refuge, those who could escape there from the avenger of blood, were only those who had inadvertently, unintentionally sinned, who were innocent. But in God's redemptive grace, as a sinner who is guilty of terrible deeds and who has no excusing circumstances, I've been invited to flee to Jesus Christ as my refuge. I'm not innocent. I'm clearly guilty. And yet God in the Lord Jesus Christ has set up a place of refuge to which we flee for protection and for safety. Listen to Hebrews 6, verses 17 to 20. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus is gone as a forerunner on our behalf. That little children's story Bible picture with the man running to the city of refuge. I was 3 or 4. It didn't explain the difference between murder and manslaughter. It didn't go into all of these details. But it said that just as the man was running to that city for refuge, you and I are invited to come to the Lord Jesus Christ to find refuge in him. And the refuge that he offers is not just for the innocent. It's particularly for those of us who are guilty and who flee to that refuge. How grateful we are for the refuge we find in the Lord Jesus Christ.